When I was a kid, I walked in on my father strangling my mother. I was 6 years old, and I had just awoken from a nap. My room was at one end of a hall, with the bedroom of my parents at the opposite end. Across from their room is a short hall which leads into the kitchen. I had planned on going there to get some juice, and so naturally I had to pass my parents' room to do so. For whatever reason, my father hadn't thought to close the door before attacking my mom. I arrived, looked into the room, and saw them struggling on the floor, my mom kicking her legs and making a horrible sound, while my dad sat on top of her, his hands around her throat, snarling in her face, actually hissing like some animal. I remember being upset in a way I couldn't understand. I was, of course, old enough to recognize real violence, but I couldn't understand how sincere aggression could be directed at my mom, certainly not by my father. I stood there, incapable of processing what it meant, but watching it nonetheless. Neither of them had noticed me, and I hadn't thought to speak up. When it was over, and my mother's legs had stopped kicking, my father got up and just stood over her for a few minutes. My child's mind thought that he must have been surprised too, after the fact, that he could have done such a thing. At some point I hiccuped, and my father spun around. I had expected him to look confused, to ask aloud, how could I do that, or express some general sense of disbelief at his crime. But he looked relieved, as if my mother's life had been some great burden, and he could at last breathe for the first time. He walked towards me, and I backed away, and even upon pressing my back against the opposite wall, I still tried to backpedal, retreating from a man who I knew, even in my young age, should not be smiling. But he crossed the threshold of the door, turned back to my mom, shook his head, still smiling, and went into the kitchen. I was left alone in the hall, facing the body on the floor in the bedroom. I had hoped for, but didn't actually expect, a surprise, for her to spring up and maybe do a dance. At 6 years old, I knew with an unbefitting clarity that a corpse rested before me. I heard the fridge in the kitchen open, close, and then the back door open. There was a patio bench out there that my father liked to sit on while drinking beers, so I assumed he was just doing that. Given that he had seen me, I wasn't sure what my instructions were from that point. Still an obedient child despite the circumstances, so I went to the kitchen. The back door had been left open, so I went over to close it. I was always lectured about that whenever I would go outside to ride my bike. To the left of the door is the bench, but my father wasn't there, and it wasn't until I had reached for the knob that I saw him walking across the yard to the neighbor's house, a bottle of beer in his hand. The Mellons were nice people, and we had them over for barbecues and parties fairly often. I watched my father knock on their back door, which also led to their kitchen, and saw Mrs. Mellon open it. She smiled at him, and without hesitation he shoved her into the home, entered, and closed the door behind him. A few minutes went by. I never left the porch. I watched their house, as if expecting it to shift and contort in accordance with whatever was going on within, like some cartoon. Eventually my father came back outside, holding the bottle, now broken, its jagged ends dripping blood. Mrs. Mellon came running out after him, though not towards him, shouting, "He's dead! Oh God, he's dead!" She looked unharmed, but clearly hysterical. Dad came back home and sat on the bench as I had initially predicted, watching the woman run around screaming. He didn't say anything to me, and I didn't know what to do, so I went back inside, closing the door behind me. I felt tired, exhausted in a deep, emotional way, so I decided to take another nap. I went down the hall, mostly ignoring the room to the right, still open, still occupied, and crawled into bed. I fell asleep immediately. I woke up again, and felt odd in a way that was not like normal fatigue, but the sudden encumbrance of years, as if successive periods of time had elapsed and I was simultaneously feeling them all. My body reflected this feeling, seeming markedly larger, although I felt a slight betterment of my coordination and strength. It was more frightening than exciting, but the thought which took my mind away from this sensation was one which brought joy to my heart. The thought being that the violence I had witnessed was nothing more than a nightmare. Also, wanting to rationalize the entire thing, I even speculated that my perceived aging was just my mind returning to normal, that my previously younger perception had been nothing more than another aspect of the nightmare. I got out of bed, intending to hug my mother and father, although I hadn't planned on telling them about the dream, just in case they thought it the result of violent cartoons and took away the privilege. I shambled down the hallway, still unaccustomed to what I had told myself was my natural form, and went into their bedroom. I saw no one there, which was relieving, and turned around to enter the kitchen. Had I entered from any other angle, I would have seen a pleasant sight. My father, sitting at the table, cup of coffee in hand, while my mother leaned over his shoulder, kissing him or perhaps whispering something in his ear. But I entered head-on, with both facing the direction from which I had arrived. My father was sitting at the table, coffee mug in his hand, the other in his lap. My mother was behind him, leaning down, one hand on his shoulder, but the other hand held a knife, which she had jammed into his neck. I walked in just as it had happened, judging by the fact that my father was still alive, and seemed fairly surprised by the appearance of the blade in his throat. Upon seeing me, he attempted to rise, and in response my mother pushed the knife deeper in. My father's body shook, and blood trickled down his neck. My mother's face was full of rage, while my father still held an expression of surprise. The pain, the inability to rise, or some other reaction caused my father's hand to tighten, and the mug therein shatter, the glass cutting into his hand. Blood and shards fell onto the table, rolled off its edge, fell to the floor. There, scattered as if they too had been knocked off the table some time before, were several photographs. I saw my father and Mrs. Mellon in them, doing things which I knew were of a very adult nature. I looked up just as my mom began dragging the blade across my father's neck. He let out a moan that was so woeful, so agonized, that I fled from the kitchen before the knife had reached the other side. I reached my room, and I closed the door. I heard the kitchen door open. I knew my mother had opened it, and where she was going. Just as I had done before, I crawled into bed, and let sleep take me away from the nightmare. I woke up, feeling even older than I had before. My clothes now seemed tight, as if they had shrunk overnight, but I knew without a doubt that I had grown. I felt smarter, somehow, surer of myself, but only in terms of self-confidence and general motor control. I got out of bed, went to my closet, and found some clothes which were more accommodating of my larger frame. As I dressed, I ran over the nightmare in my head, and what they meant for the future. As I dressed, I ran over the nightmares in my head, and what they meant for the future. Being older, I had the cognitive refinement to properly ruminate, to assess my situation and make predictions. And what I came to imagine chilled my blood. My father had killed my mother. My mother had then killed my father. There were reasons for both slayings, a narrative of adultery and revenge. Because I had grown, and had no memories to accompany the space and time between my first awakening and the latest iteration, I assumed that the macabre process would continue, that someone else would die. I feared, was terribly frightened by, the prospect that I would be next in line, that one or both of my parents would find some reason to murder me. This small step in logic, although I can understand it seeming like a leap, kick-started my instinctual responses. I first went into my bedroom and quietly locked it, then scanned the room for anything which could be used as a defensive object. My ears perked themselves up, listening for anything which could be interpreted as malicious advancing. I heard only the soft sounds of the house, pipes straining against their own weight, shingles tapping against the roof as the wind tossed a current at them. Everything, at least audibly, seemed normal. I kept a flashlight on a nightstand beside my bed. I wasn't exactly afraid of the dark, but I didn't think there was anything wrong with having a handy tool to dispel it if necessary. It was a pretty hefty thing, one of my dad's old models, which made it seem even more powerful to me as a child. I grabbed it, tried not to think about how much lighter it felt in my undeniably larger hand, and gripped it like a club. I unlocked and slowly opened my bedroom door and peered out into the hallway. It was empty, and had the unmistakable quality of time's passage. Dust coated every surface, and the air seemed heavier, smelled of musk and slowly rotting wood. I wasn't sure if I should be relieved or unsettled by the house sharing in my inexplicable advancement of age, so I tried focusing on listening for sounds of other occupants. I crept up to my parents' bedroom, the doorway open as it had been the last 2 times. Shoulder against the wall, I peered in and saw that it was empty. While nothing looked structurally different, it was clear that age and slow decay had touched this room as well. I left the hall and entered the kitchen. I half expected to find the kitchen empty, with the table and floor bearing the stains of dried blood from the murder I witnessed. But the only visible imperfection was the pervasive dust, which grayly mottled everything it touched. Turning left, I entered the living room, where I had yet to venture since the start of the cyclic nightmare. To my astonishment, there wasn't any visible dust in this room. My parents were sitting on the couch, watching TV. They saw me, and neither of them expressed anything which suggested they harbored malicious desires. My mother smiled at me, as did my father, and he scooted away from her on the couch, patting a spot between them for me to sit down. To my right, the TV was aglow, and the coffee table between it and my parents held a tray of snacks. Everything, as far as I could remember, looked perfectly normal. However, they both looked somewhat older, and didn't seem to notice that several years had been added to my age overnight. I was obviously surprised, and, well, probably only 13 years old, questioned my sanity at that moment. The things I had seen, the rooms just feet away, none of it made sense in relation to the relative normalcy of the living room, nor my parents' acceptance of the bizarre circumstances. I took a step towards them, intending to sit down and hopefully find comfort and maybe even reason in their embrace, when I was overcome by a feeling that stopped me dead. I felt a presence enter me. Not exactly possess me, but its influence, its will, provide me with some warped insight. A dark intimation of what must occur next was somehow conveyed to me. The cycle, the tradition of violence, had not yet ended. Someone would still have to die. It wasn't until I had ventured closer to my parents that I realized they, together, were to be the next slain, and I was to be their executioner. The flashlight I had brought to use as a club would be used for that purpose, only not defensively. I felt hot tears swell in my eyes, and I came to hate the ill-gotten strength with which I had awoken. My parents watched me as if nothing were wrong, and that made me feel even worse, that they were totally oblivious to the fate which awaited them. Even as I tried to resist, tried to fight the dark motivator, I felt its desires mingle with my own, corrupting them. Crying, shrieking wildly, spittle and tears flying everywhere, I clubbed my parents to death. My father took a while to die, and although he was hurt, not just physically, he never resisted, even as I struggled to bludgeon his skull. I saw, beneath the pain, a certain understanding. My mother took only a little while, and she cried out just as wildly as I had. With each swing, we both grew louder until she suddenly stopped, and only I could be heard. Once done, I sat on the floor, crying aloud without restraint, probably waking the entire neighborhood. I must have cried myself to sleep, as I had often done as a younger kid, because I suddenly awoke on my bed. I felt even older than I had been, and the dust which had previously coated the room now sat in heaps and piles atop the dressers, tables, and chairs, clung to the drapes and blankets as a cloak, carpeted the floorboards, leaving not a single spot of visible wood left. I reached across me to pull aside the blanket, and what had felt like material was only a thick coating of dust, which my hand obliterated as it made contact. I got up and brushed myself off and made yet another trip to the closet, where I managed to find a single pair of pants that fit my enlarged body. My shirt, now a size too small, would have to do. The small hairs on my body stood on end, and I became aware of a looming threat, some instinctively recognized danger that my consciousness had yet to identify. I felt that something lurked both within and without the room. Inside, a vaguer, less physical presence. Outside, something more human, although I sensed a relation between the two entities. I would have tried to focus on what had settled over the atmosphere of the room if my door hadn't burst open. My father stood at the threshold, carrying an axe that I recognized as the one usually affixed to a wall in the garage. He held the axe in his left hand, and in the right he had a piece of paper. He threw the document towards me, and after a bit of fluttering it came to rest on the floor. I saw its header, something pertaining to DNA results. He spoke 5 words before swinging the axe at me. "I won't raise his child." The words had barely registered before I felt the blade sink into my neck. My father was always a strong man, and when empowered by anger and indignation, his strength was practically Herculean. Thankfully, or not, depending on how you'd feel in my position, death brought the same outcome as sleep, and I again woke in my bed, head attached, submerged beneath mounds of dust. I had just enough time to realize that my legs now dangled over the edge of my bed before my mother barged into the room carrying a hammer. That ominous pedestrian presence oversaw the collapse of my skull, never taking action itself, only supervising my mother's filicide. Again, in my bed, probably 20 years old, I waited, my entire body except one eye and a patch of forehead blanketed by dust. The room was now only gray shapes, the light through the window barely managing to extend inches beyond the glass. It was a struggle now to unearth myself from the ashen entombment. I didn't bother looking for better-fitting clothes. I knew there'd be none. I grabbed the flashlight, since even as a younger, weaker iteration it had been used fairly efficiently, and ventured out into the house. They were in the laundry room this time, working on a load together. Instructed by that watchful motivator, I did the dark duty required of me. Compelled by my own guilt, I then went into the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and removed myself from the scenario as well. Again, in bed, the dust seemed to vibrate, to shift of its own accord, and I was no longer able to discern individual objects through its covering. I was buried, forced to exert tremendous effort just to break free from my bed-lane internment. I stumbled to the door, opened it, and received the end of a pair of hedge clippers in my stomach for my efforts. The blades were withdrawn. I fell to my knees and watched as my mother, so old now, drove them into my neck. It took an hour to free myself from my room. I didn't bother looking around or anticipating some attack. I tunneled through the dust-choked hallway, then broke down a wall of the stuff to get into the kitchen. Once there, I felled pillars and toppled mountains until I made it to the living room. A figure sat on the couch, barely identifiable as a body, while another sat in a chair near a window, through which light was barely allowed. Neither moved. I knew, grimly, that it would have taken only a nudge to collapse those forms, and thus complete my turn of the perennial cycle. That the only thing left of my parents were those simulacra of dust. Despite the compounding of age, the stacking of incalculable years upon their shoulders, I sensed that they were still alive. Somehow. The motivator, that omniscient presence which oversaw our ruination, no longer urged me to commit patricide or matricide. I think it too had grown so terribly old that its influence had dwindled to near nothing. Or perhaps we, were simply obsolete, our parts too rusted to properly receive its influence. Something told me to look at myself, so I glanced down. There, creeping up my right leg, was a sheath of dust, already up to my kneecap. I hadn't felt it crawl onto my skin. I watched it edge its way up, silently, hungrily. Suddenly I became tired, and wanted to go sit beside whomever was the form on the couch. I took a step forward with the dust-eaten leg, and it collapsed when the foot landed. I fell, painlessly, and before my body had even settled, the dust came crawling to envelop me. From my position on the floor, I saw beneath the moldering bulk of the couch an object whose color wasn't a dismal gray. It was actually sticking out from the base, dangling maybe an inch above the powdered floor. It was red, and the color was incredibly striking amidst everything else. I began crawling to it, and found that I only had one arm available to manage the effort. The other, having been clad in dust, had disintegrated at the first attempt to move. The dust, everywhere in the room, seemed to advance towards me. Stalactites descended from the ceiling, falling slowly, homing in on my body. Pillars and spires leaned towards me, threatening to collapse and add my atoms to the murk. But the distance was short, and I reached the object beneath the couch before any considerable dust form caught me. I dislodged it, and found myself looking at a grill lighter, the black barrel and red handle both unblemished. The air itself, more dust than breathable oxygen, seemed to force itself into my body and swell within my lungs, bringing its ruin upon my organs, degrading my cells. I felt my mind being undone, my thoughts fragmented and faded, as if the degeneration had wrought some mental dusk as well. My last thought, the final impulse toward action before being subsumed by the encroaching dust, was to use the lighter. With an arm whose bones were grayed and crumbling, I raised it and pressed the switch. I saw the flame flicker to life, and the dust particulate suspended in the air ignite, and the world go up in flames, the entire house one combustible thing. I woke up in my bed again. I pulled aside the cover, normal, soft and cotton. I got out of a bed that was much too small, wearing clothes similarly inadequate, but neither had a speck of dust that I could see. Light shone through the window beside my bed, illuminating a room which only had the expected pockets of dust, behind bookshelves, beneath dressers, but was otherwise clean. I walked through an unburnt house. I was alone. I'm now 28 years old. The world had aged normally outside the house. Within, time had sped through the halls, dragging along with it everything it had touched. I grew up, became an adult, without ever having left the confines of my childhood home. I had not eaten, although I wouldn't have been surprised if the dust had acted as my sustenance through the years. Exercise was presumably gained through violent murder. Intelligence had come with age, although I didn't acquire the wisdom and worldly experience appropriate for my age until much later. I found no sign of my parents, and all the photos which showed them were nearly a decade old. Even when knowing that the purgatorial cycle had been broken, I was afraid to sleep, lest it all be restarted. I didn't leave the house for days, though. Despite it having been my prison for what felt like millennia, I had grown dependent upon the familiarity of its design. My journey through the world was, as you can imagine, rather odd. I made a fool of myself several times. I was looked upon as crazy, dangerous, and even briefly considered responsible for the unexplained disappearance of my parents, although there wasn't any evidence for my involvement. For some reason, the house hadn't been seized by the state. The mail had stopped coming, but no one can remember giving the order for its cessation. Our closest neighbors, both of whom were alive, dimly remembered us, but couldn't recall the last time they had seen my parents, and were plainly startled by my sudden appearance. The house had been left alone, its inhabitants forgotten. I was considered a mystery, and probably even a slight risk to the greater community by the authorities, who dealt with me during my search for answers. I was detained, questioned, released, and eventually managed to find a place to squat. One day, I was invited to a shelter, and it was there that I was told enough about the world to navigate through its physical and social obstacles. I learned the rest of what I know now through the internet and books. There are still a lot of things that I'm, of course, pitifully ignorant about. Compared to me, everyone had a huge head start in education, and I don't think I'll ever catch up. I've never figured out what presence had settled upon my family's home and forced us into that near-infinite erosion. Honestly, I hope I never do. As for my parents, I have more memories of them dying at my hands, or me at theirs, than I do of our normal family life. The predominant memories keep me up at night, and the smallest particle of dust elicits an episode of extreme anxiety. There's nothing left for me to do but enjoy the unhurried crawl of time that you all take for granted.